Ladies and gentlemen, I could have your attention. I'm Michael Swetnam. I'm CEO of the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, and it's my distinct honor to welcome you today to the 17th annual seminar on international cooperation in combating terrorism. The Potomac Institute has been privileged for almost 2 decades to be an organization in the Washington, D.C. area focused on the study of science, technology, how it is affecting our society and our security around the world. In particular, the Institute from its inception has been interested in and engaging in the study of how terrorism has been used as a form of warfare or social disobedience, if you will, by many around the world for, in fact, centuries, and how today we might find ways of more effectively dealing with this scourge through cooperations between governments, law enforcement, and military organizations. Today, we, as I said, welcome you all to the 17th annual review of combating terrorism and international cooperation in doing so. And we have with us today, I think, one of the most enlightened and in fact, engaged and scholarly groups that you can imagine on this topic that represent not just the countries that have been affected by terrorism, but those who have worked together with the United States and amongst themselves to deal with this issue for quite some time. We'd like to highlight for you that the work at the Potomac Institute on terrorism is focused in the International Center for Terrorism Studies, headed up by Professor Yonah Alexander. And out of this organization comes many publications and studies, and we host several seminars every year on all aspects of terrorism globally as well as domestically. Our most recent publications, and Yonah has averaged at least 1 per month for the last 40 years, are in February, our 6th annual review of terror incidents in North Africa and their impacts on the peoples of that part of the world, and a review of Europe's political situation and how that is affecting the use of terror by those that feel disenfranchised or for whatever means are causing civil disobedience in that part of the world. As I said, the Center for Terrorism Studies at the Potomac Institute produces at least 1 document per month all year long and averages 1 or 2 books per year. And we're very proud that we host several seminars on all aspects of terrorism. We welcome your review of that on our website. We'd be glad to provide you summaries of all of that work. And of course, you're all invited to those events as they take place. We hope that today is not just enlightening, but it's an opportunity for you to engage with those that have been involved in dealing with this issue on a very personal and professional level from all around the world. At this point in time, 17 years into the Potomac Institute gathering with you every year to discuss the role of terrorism in destabilizing our society, it's unfortunate that we have to recognize that the world is one of the most unstable positions that it has been in a very, very long time, due to a large extent to the use of terror and terror tactics and techniques by various groups around the world against the governments and societies that we look to protect us. There have been more incidents in the last year and a half than there were in quite some years before that, and many people of the world are in fact terrorized as they haven't been for many years before. As we've developed our techniques for dealing with terror, those who use terror against us have consequently, unfortunately, modified and grown their capabilities to terrorize us. This calls for all of us to not just study it more, but find more effective ways for dealing with it and limiting the impact of terror on our society. So we hope that you will take the time today not just to hear what the enlightened panel has to say, but to also engage with them and to once again commit yourself and all of us to dealing with this issue as effectively as we can for ourselves, for our children. With that, I'd like to turn the program over to Professor Yonah Alexander, who most of you know, I hope. If you don't, then you probably shouldn't be here, because there isn't anybody in the world of terrorism studies academically in the world that doesn't know about Professor Alexander. He has published over 100 books. He has been studying terrorism and the effects of terrorism and all issues surrounding terrorism for more than 40 years. And he is what we consider one of the greatest assets that the human race has on this aspect and on this topic. We're privileged to have him here today. He will chair this program, introduce most of the speakers, and it's my privilege to introduce to you today Professor Yonah Alexander.
So, thank you very much, Mike, for your introduction, particularly trying to stress the nature and the intensity of the terrorist threat and what can we do about this. What I would like to do is to discharge a few academic, I think, requirements. First of all, to introduce our distinguished panel. First, to my left, to your right, is Professor Bonnie Ambassador Jenkins. She's both a diplomat and a scholar at the U.S. Department of State Coordinator for Threat Reduction Programs in the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation. I will also introduce her a little bit later on. So she will be the first speaker. Next is Dr. Alaa Abdalaziz, who is political counselor of the Embassy of the Arab Republic of Egypt and a former Chargé d'Affaires at the Embassy of Egypt in Syria. Is going to speak immediately after Ambassador Jenkins. And then we are very pleased to have Mrs. Wafa Bughaighis from the Embassy of Libya. She is the Chargé d'Affaires, and she will present the views related to Libya. We are waiting for the Ambassador Husain Haqqani, a former ambassador of Pakistan to the US, and is director currently at the Hudson Institute of South and Central Asia. He will be right with us very shortly. And next is Ambassador Theodore Katov, former US ambassador to the United Arab Emirates and Syria. And then the Governor James Gilmore is on his way, and he will speak. Is there? Well, you're quicker than my eyes, but at any rate, you're very, very welcome. We appreciate that you came all the way from Richmond here, and he's going to speak, and then, of course, to make some closing remarks, General Alfred Gray, as you know, the 29th Commandant of the United States Marine Corps, and currently Senior Fellow and Chairman of the Board of Regents of the Potomac Institute. I think that before we have the speakers deal with the issues, a few footnotes. First of all, I'm delighted that we have in the audience many diplomats, ambassadors, representatives, academics, and so forth. We appreciate very much CISPAN and other media representatives for bringing our discussion to a wider audience in the United States and internationally. Traditionally, academically, we like to express our sympathy with the families of the victims of terrorism throughout the world, as well as to send a message of solidarity and support for international cooperation in dealing with terrorism. And of course, this is our mission. First, to learn the lessons of the past and to try to anticipate future trends and provide some, hopefully, best practices recommendations for counterterrorism strategies, particularly related to international cooperation in dealing with terrorism. Now, if I may, I would like to mention some key questions, because if we look at the history, the historical record, the historical lessons, if we go back 43 years ago, I recall very vividly when the United Nations placed on the General Assembly agenda to deal with a specific item which they called measures to prevent terrorism and other forms of violence which endanger or take innocent lives or jeopardize fundamental freedoms. Now, 43 years ago, this was the message, and 43 years later, we're still struggling with some key questions that I hope that perhaps we can clarify today. One is, who are the terrorists? Who are the perpetrators? Two, what are some of the root causes that motivates them? And thirdly, what can we do about it? I think what is very interesting to mention at this particular point, that as we speak, there is a coalition being formed to combat terrorism, which I believe is very similar to the concept of NATO. In other words, from regional to global or inter-regional security concerns, and to provide that kind of support. As we speak, as all of us know, an operation called Operation Decisive Storm is being actually mounted by the Arab countries and some non-Arab countries in order to deal with the issue of Yemen. This is an historic, I think, move, and certainly we're going to deal with that. Now, if I move on to the record, Mike referred to it, but let me mention very quickly. One, if you look at the data, the statistics of last year, we had some 11,000 incidents throughout the world. In other words, it is an increase from 2013 and prior to that in general. Already the first 3 months of this year, we see an escalation throughout the world, all the way from Egypt and Libya and Syria and Pakistan, Nigeria, and so on and so forth. It seems to me if this trend really continues, unfortunately, 2015 will be recorded as the bloodiest year yet since 9/11. Mike mentioned one of our recent publications related to terrorism in North Africa and the Sahel, and the impacts regionally and globally. We do have copies for those who might be interested. Let me just mention that we're covering a broad area all the way from health security, for example, the Ebola crisis. And in general, I think we have to look at the record. And the record of last year, 2014, for example, there is an increase of 30% in North Africa and the Sahel over 2013. And again, if you look at 9/11, from 9/11, you look at that particular region, which really underscores the nature of the threat, there is an increase of 800%, and so on. And today we're going to discuss several of the countries in the region. Again, there are many terrorist groups involved in this activity. Some are regional, and some are foreign fighters, and so forth. So I think we're going to deal with both the domestic situation, the internal situation, as well as the external support of violence in that particular region and elsewhere. I think what is really important for us is not only to identify the threat, but also to develop, as I indicated before, some best practices to deal with the problem. We do have some suggestions in our report. You can look at this. And again, this is only one region, and Mike mentioned also the report on Europe, and particularly I would like to also mention the study that we completed that is now in production on NATO, dealing with issues in Europe itself, such as the Ukraine, Afghanistan, and elsewhere around the world. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce the first speaker today. As I mentioned, Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. She has a very rich background. I'm not going to go into details. You do have the bios of the speakers. I would only mention that she covers a great deal, I think, of areas all the way from the global health security agenda to weapons of mass destruction. And she obviously has a very rich background also in the academic community, working with many universities and think tanks, and she published extensively. So I asked actually Ambassador Jenkins to provide some context for the discussion today. Thank you.
I think I'm going to actually stay here if that's okay.
Would you like to come here?
No, actually, I'll stay right here, yes. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Yonah, to this, and to the organizers. And it's great to see everyone out here today. I know that we have a distinguished panel here, so I'm going to try to keep my comments brief. My work in the government really focuses on ways in which we can keep weapons of mass destruction materials and weapons out of the hands of non-state actors. So my perspective in terms of international cooperation in combating terrorism is that it's very important to have international cooperation. The only way we can really address the problems of terrorism is to work together on a global scale, to work bilaterally, multilaterally with partners. And the work that I do really does foster that effort and really does foster ways in which we can develop programs to actually make sure that we do not have opportunities for non-state actors to use chemical, biological, nuclear, or radiological weapons. The U.S. has really developed a number of tools and initiatives to address this issue, whether they are through international organizations, working with international organizations, whether it's working through specific initiatives, whether it's working on the ground bilaterally with countries. There are a number of ways in which we have been focusing on addressing a very complex threat when you're trying to follow individuals around the world who may want to actually get access to pathogens, to precursors, to nuclear materials so they could use it for harm. There are a number of things that I work on at State Department in this arena. One is I've worked since 2009 on the Nuclear Security Summit, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. It's an effort that was started in 2009 by President Obama in his first speech, his first Prague speech, where he announced that nuclear terror is one of the greatest threats the world faces. And he announced that we would have a security summit to bring together leaders around the world to focus on this important issue, recognizing that in order to prevent nuclear terrorism, you want to prevent the access of nuclear material. So as you probably know, there have been a number of nuclear security summits since that speech. There was one in 2010 here in Washington, followed by the 2012 summit in Seoul and 2014 in The Hague. And there'll be a final summit under the current format in 2016 in the United States, the place and time to yet be determined. Through these nuclear security summits, we have worked with 54 leaders 4 international organizations included in that, working to provide commitments, communiques, and other efforts to ensure that states who are working with us are doing what they can to secure nuclear materials. We've done this through a number of national commitments. There have been a number of what we call gift baskets, which are actually commitments by a group of countries on particular areas of nuclear security. And we've done it through, as I said, through communiques. And in 2010, we had something called a work plan, which was about a 6-page document that outlined activities countries could do to secure nuclear material. So through this process of the nuclear security summits, we have been providing ways in which we can we can consolidate nuclear material, get rid of excess nuclear material, and really focus on ways in which we can coordinate and work together internationally and with international organizations like the IAEA, Interpol, and the UN and the EU to work together to prevent nuclear terrorism in the future. As I said, there's another summit that's being prepared for now amongst the Sherpas of a number of countries, and you'll be hearing a lot more about the upcoming summit in the next few months. One of the other aspects about international cooperation is a recognition that we need to work with not only governments, but entities outside the government as well. Through the Nuclear Security Summit, there's been a process of working very closely with non-governmental organizations and industry, which are very important parts of ensuring that we do secure nuclear material. So when we talk about international cooperation, we're talking not just about governments, we're talking about all the entities that exist around the globe that can help ensure that we prevent nuclear terrorism. Another entity that exists that I am the U.S. representative to is something called the G7 Global Partnership. This is an initiative that was started in 2002 in Kananaskis under the then G8 chairmanship of Canada. And the main focus of this, as the title entails, which is the Global Partnership Against the Spread of Weapons and Materials of Mass Destruction, was established for the main purpose of ensuring that we do not let WMD get in the hands of non-state actors. It's been in existence, as I said, since 2002, and it was actually set up to be a 10-year commitment amongst the G8 members, with the United States putting in $10 billion, matched by $10 billion of the other members. We now have 28 members of the Global Partnership, so it's grown a lot since 2002. It was extended in 2011 to include looking at all areas of WMD. For the first 10 years of the Global Partnership, the main focus was destroying Russian nuclear submarines and Russian chemical weapons. We spent over $23 billion in the first few years in the Global Partnership. Now the Global Partnership is looking at all areas of chemical, biological, nuclear, and chemical weapons to prevent those from getting into the hands of non-state actors. And as I said, it now has 28 members who are a part of this initiative. Some of the activities that the Global Partnership has been engaged include, under nuclear and radiological security, the physical protection of nuclear materials, securing the transport of nuclear materials, radioactive security, prevention of illicit nuclear trafficking, material management, verification and compliance, and work on export controls. In the area of biosecurity, there's work in securing and accounting for biological pathogens, preventing deliberate biological attacks, strengthening disease surveillance and detection, reinforcing biological nonproliferation instruments like the Biological Weapons Convention, and the safe and secure responsible conduct in biological sciences, or what we sometimes call security culture. In chemical destruction, the Global Partnership members have completed the projects remaining for Kisner projects, assisting in destruction and activities in Syria and Libya, and prepared to assist in the destruction of newly declared stockpiles. In addition, I should mention that last year, the Global Partnership has been having meetings focusing on CBRN security assistance in Ukraine. Ukraine is one of the members of the Global Partnership. It has been a member since 2003. And as a result of recent activities in Ukraine, we have been meeting and working with Ukraine and trying to address some of their CBRN threats that they have right now in the security arena. As we look at 2014, which is one of the questions in this effort, in this panel, 2014 was an interesting year for the Global Partnership. As I mentioned, the Global Partnership is now a G7 entity. Last year, during the, Russia, of course, was president of G8 at the time, but as a result of their actions in Ukraine, it was decided that they would no longer be a part of the G8, and so now it's a G7 Global Partnership, but there were a few months, of course, where there was no chairmanship of the Global Partnership. However, fortunately, Germany took over the chair at the G7 summit last year, and so we've been having meetings again as a result of that. There's been a lot of work, as I said, in Syria. It was really all Global Partnership members that were involved in the destruction of chemical weapons. Denmark, the US, Italy, Germany, the UK, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Canada, and others are all Global Partnership members. So they all played a significant role in the destruction of chemical weapons in Syria. And as I said, we've been working with Ukraine on some of their issues. And looking beyond, there will continue to be work on CBRN security issues in Ukraine. In the biosecurity area, we'll be continuing to focus on biosecurity projects. I should also mention one other area that's getting a lot of attention is something called the Global Health Security Agenda. For those of you who don't know what this is, it's an effort that was started last year in the United States with a launch in Washington, D.C. to focus on how do we try to address infectious disease threats, trying to reduce those threats like Ebola. This is an effort that was started in February last year, so it was, of course, prior to the Ebola, the attention that Ebola received. But the focus of the Global Health Security Agenda, which is led by the White House, is to reduce infectious disease threats, and it now has 44 countries that are working on this effort. It's both a security effort, it's also a human health and animal health effort. It includes law enforcement, and as a result, in the United States, you have quite a number of departments who have traditionally not been working on threat reduction programs are now involved because we're looking at infectious disease and how to fight infectious disease from a prevent, detect, and respond lens, which means that brings in a lot of different departments in the United States. We've been working on this effort with a number of countries. As I said, 44 countries are now involved in this effort to try to reduce infectious disease threats. And there are a number of actions that these 44 countries are looking at. This is an activity that the Global Partnership is also working with. And as I mentioned in Nuclear Security Summit, which was focused on the nuclear area, the Global Health Security Agenda is very similar and is focused on the bio area. Those are just some of the programs. I could keep going. There's quite a few things that we're engaged in trying to ensure that weapons of mass destruction do not get in the hands of terrorists. These are just a few of them: the Global Partnership, the Nuclear Security Summit, the Global Health Security Agenda. I can go into detail on any of those during the question and answer period, but with so many distinguished guests on the panel, I think I will stop now and turn it over to our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jenkins. Next speaker is Dr. Alaa Abdalaziz, who is the political counselor at the Embassy of Egypt in the U.S., and formerly he was the Chargé affairs at the Embassy of Egypt in Syria between 2012 and 2014. So he obviously has great deal of experience and knowledge also elsewhere in the region. And I would like to mention that also he worked at the United Nations regarding a project of African peacekeeping operations. And he has a PhD in international relations from Helsinki University in Finland.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking the Potomac Institute for organizing this important event. And of course, special thanks to Professor Alexander Yonah, whom I know has put a lot of effort for this event to take place. I think the best way to discuss the issue of international cooperation to combat terrorism is to try to start with a global image of terrorism today. Starting from Africa, by all means, I think Boko Haram, this terrorist organization in Nigeria, is now deeply rooted in the Nigerian society compared to 4 or 5 years ago. Not only this, Boko Haram has gone through an important transformation process. It started as a Nigerian organization, and now it's a transnational organization working very effectively in other societies like Cameroon, Chad, Niger, Benin, Burkina Faso, beside Nigeria, of course. I very much recommend that you read this excellent report Professor Yonah just mentioned about terrorism in North Africa and the Sahel in 2014. It shows clearly, the figures and numbers here, that the terrorism is a growing threat in Africa, whether we are talking about North Africa, the Sahel area, or West Africa. If we move to Asia, I think the reason why the US administration decided recently to keep more troops in Afghanistan is that there is a rebirth of Al-Qaeda and Taliban in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. Recent reports have shown that these two organizations are now adopting more efficient approaches to recruit more young people in both countries. If we move to the Middle East, we have, of course, ISIL, the so-called Islamic State for Iraq and the Levant, or Daesh, which is controlling large areas in Iraq, including the second most important city, Mosul, and large areas as well in Syria. They are active also in countries like Libya, like Egypt. I was trying to aggregate some info about Daesh recently, and I discovered that during the last 6 months only in 6 months, 31 different organizations announced their support or allegiance to ISIS. And those 31 organizations are working in 16 different countries. Some of them are with majority of Muslims, like, as I mentioned, Egypt or Libya or Indonesia, and some others are with non-Muslim majority, like India. If we move to Europe, recently the EU counter-terrorism coordinator said that there are 4,000 foreign fighters, European fighters, fighting alongside ISIL in Iraq and Syria. 25% out of them have already returned back home. They are back home with better knowledge, better skills, and better networking if they want to use this knowledge and skills and network in conducting more terrorist organizations in any European society. I once asked a US security expert, is it the same with your country? And he said, no, fortunately, we don't have thousands of Americans fighting alongside ISIS. We have a couple of hundred only. But this doesn't mean that we are safe, because it takes only 10 to have another 9/11. The point I'm trying to make here is that we are facing a growing challenge, not a declining one. And this is, I think, the first lesson we should know about our enemy in this regard. The second lesson is that we are facing a transnational threat. So no country can face or combat this threat on its own. We need to build regional as well as international coalitions in order to fight this threat effectively. The third lesson is that we need to have our objectives as clear as possible. Are we aiming to degrade these terrorist organizations, contain them, or eliminate them? Depending on our objective, we will be able to define the ways and means we are going to adopt in order to fight terrorism. A fourth lesson, I think, is time. Time is of crucial importance. Professor Alexander mentioned that I was the Chargé d'Affaires in Syria for more than 2 years. this month, the Syrians are celebrating the 4th anniversary of their revolution. Let me remind you that in March 2011, when this revolution started, there wasn't a single terrorist organization in Syria, not a single one. Because the international community was reluctant to support this revolution. Now we have ISIS, we have Jabhat al-Nusra, we have Ahrar al-Sham, we have tens or maybe hundreds of terrorist organizations in Syria. I hope we, the international community, are not repeating this mistake again in Libya. That's why Egypt, in cooperation with Libya and other countries, were very keen to urge the Security Council to adopt a resolution to enable the legitimate government, the Libyan legitimate government, to combat terrorism. Finally, 2 days ago, the Security Council adopted 2 important resolutions in this regard. I hope we will have the courage and the political will to implement these 2 resolutions. The final lesson, I think, is the military tool to combat terrorism is, of course, very important. But it's not enough. Ideology is of crucial importance. That's why we have been calling for a revolution in Islamic thought recently. The need to revisit the Islamic thought and develop a counter-narrative for the ideology of terrorist organizations in order to show the young people in the Islamic societies that this is a misinterpretation of the Quran and the real Islam, and it's a sort of manipulation from the from the terrorist organizations. We have been sending scholars to societies suffering from terrorism, like in Nigeria, in Iraq, in Syria, in order to listen to this terrorist narrative and come back to develop a counter one, translate it into local languages, put it in a book, and go distribute it in schools, in mosques, in local communities, in order to make sure that the right interpretation of Islam is there. Fighting the finance of terrorism is also important, to make sure that terrorist organizations are not controlling oil refineries or border crossings. They are not getting ransoms. They are not even collecting taxes or receiving international financial support. Socioeconomic development is also important. Recent studies have shown that it's much easier for terrorist organizations to recruit young people who are jobless. So that's an important element to take into consideration. For example, in Egypt, while we are fighting terrorism in Sinai, we have allocated 10 billion Egyptian pounds for development in Sinai in order to make sure that we are creating jobs hand in hand with fighting terrorist groups in Sinai. Finally, stabilization and humanitarian assistance is also equally important. Tomorrow, we have a very important ministerial meeting in Kuwait for international donors in order to raise funds to support Syrian refugees and internally displaced. We have a humanitarian catastrophe of 16 million people suffering only with the Syrian nationality. If we add the Iraqis, the Libyans, the Yemenis, the picture will be so gloomy. I think I'll stop here and yeah, we can get back to these points during the Q&A period. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're moving on to Mrs. Wafa Bughaighis, who is chargé d'affaires of the Embassy of Libya. Not only that she is a foreign policy expert, but also an engineer, an educator, and human rights advocates. And clearly, many of us are very much interested in your views, particularly to clarify the confusion about Libya this time.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? It's okay. Thank you so much. Let me first thank the Potomac Institute for organizing this event. Thank you, Professor Yonah Alexander. Ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, it's my pleasure to make a presentation about Libya and what's going on and our vision for countering the wave of terrorism that we've been hit by lately. Each day, as the future of Libya is being discussed by various parties in Morocco, the fierce battle for my country's soul and democracy continues to be wagged in the streets and in different towns. We and the world cannot wait for the formal formation of a new unity government before we act in a strong, united front against the scourge that's terrorizing my home and my fellow Libyans. Ladies and gentlemen, as I stand before you here, young men are being recruited into joining extremist groups and shipped cross borders to come and create havoc in my country. Right now, and as I am speaking to you, men in my country are dying while trying alongside our military troops with minimal support and resources to fight back the new evil that's trying to steal away our dreams, our values, our culture, our history, and our wealth. Ladies and gentlemen, as I'm talking before you here, weapons are being delivered to terrorist groups. Funds are being provided across borders to buy them more weapons to fight our young democracy and prosperity, to fight tolerance, to disrupt and send wrong messages about our peaceful, tolerant religion, to fight the same human rights in the international conventions and charters that we are all in this room signatory to reverse the right to life, the right to freedom, the right to good living and to good education, and the right to be free from oppression, submission, and coercion. Today, as we look at what's going on in the world, we realize that terrorism knows no religion and does not restrict itself to borders, nor to morals. Terrorism is the same anywhere and committed by the same persons across the globe. However, there do exist certain communities and societies where terrorism has a bigger risk to thrive and do harm. Societies where citizens have been deprived from their basic rights for too long. Countries like Libya, where tyranny and oppression ruled for over 43 years, where empowerment of women and youth is not a priority, and where economic rights have been abused for too long. We know today the importance and impact of reforming the global economic systems so that all people have access to better living standards and opportunities for all equally. We know now that reforming the educational systems is paramount to each core human values: tolerance, respect of human rights and to one another, deprivation and lack of political will to enforce social justice is one of the most important reasons for making countries fall into the web of terrorism and radical movements. The attacks carried at home by terrorist groups, whether on the government or civilian in states, the execution of Libyan activists, military personnel, foreigners in Libya, the attack on oil fields, airports, and ports in Libya, and the spread of extremism will not affect only Libya, but the whole region, and we fear, as Libya is a gateway to Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, that those acts of terrorism will spill into the region. We feel that a global task force needs to work on a proposal to produce an international charter that deals with radical movements and terrorism. Laws have to change in order to control the spillage of weapons and funds into the hands of terrorists. Nations have to stop their support to rogue groups with fundamental thinking. Time is running, and our existence in this world as neighbors with common goals and mutual interests is at big risk. We need to work together to enforce order and keep our world safe and stable place for the future generations to live in. It's our responsibility as world policy makers and the responsibility of the world leaders to work on common goals and to put together a global charter that regulates the flow of arms, drugs, money, and radicalism, to leave fighting terrorism to countries which are weakened by it, and NGOs and communities alone is not enough. It's hardly fair. In Libya, we are committed to work with the world leaders and policy makers to end corruption and make sure human rights are not violated. We are committed and persistent in the pursuit of an economic stability in our country that will lead to better living standards to our people and that will not impact negatively on the region and the globe. Esteemed colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, you are all aware today that Libya, amongst other nations, is fighting a vicious war against terrorism and radical thinking groups. This is not a threat to Libya alone. I emphasize that, and I say it again and again. And it's not a threat to its people and future prosperity and progress alone, but to the whole region and to the neighboring European countries and the economy of European countries that rely on our oil and gas and on Africa, and this will impact negatively on the strategic interests of the United States of America. We invite and will support strongly all research work and civil work to further shed light on the precursors of terrorism in order to find the best ways to contain it and fight it. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a difficult fight to endure that requires putting all of the resources and efforts to make the outcome a winning one for the sake of humanity and history. The history of the world is filled with agonizing encounters, but let us try to change this history forever. Our children, your children, and the world's children deserve that much of an effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insights, and we'll come back to the discussion to raise some related questions. We're going to move on to our next speaker. We're honored to have Ambassador Husain Haqqani, who, as many of you know, was the ambassador of Pakistan to the U.S. From 2008 to 2011, and is currently a senior fellow and director of South Asia, Central Asia program at the Hudson Institute. At the same time, is also the director of the Center of International Relations and professor of practice and international relations at Boston University. In addition to his very distinguished diplomatic and academic work, is very well known as a journalist, written extensively on international affairs throughout the world. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here in such distinguished company. I will keep my remarks relatively short. Terrorism, we all realize, is an international problem, and it needs an international solution. Post 9/11, there appeared to be a global consensus, and at that point, almost every nation in the world said that it agreed with the notion that no grievance and no injustice in the global system justified terrorism. Yet, almost 14 years later, we find that terrorism is not only alive and well, but is thriving in many parts of the world. What exactly has happened in these almost 14 years? Many of you might recall Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, writing a memo on October the 16th, 2003, in which he acknowledged a long, hard slog in Afghanistan and Iraq. He said that America, with its might, will prevail in both countries where it had gone to war after 9/11, but that it would be a long, hard slog. And in that memo, he posed a very interesting question to his staff. And the question was, quote, "Are we capturing, killing, or deterring and dissuading more terrorists every day than the madrasas and radical clerics are recruiting, training, and deploying against us?" We can all now, with hindsight, answer the question that no. In fact, I am one of those who would argue that the very notion that you could capture, kill, and deter terrorists purely by military means was an erroneous notion. And the very fact that two wars started and resulted in major American involvement caused a situation in which, instead of building a true global alliance against terrorism as a concept, what ended up happening was the unleashing of constructive instability in a manner in which the construction has yet to come, and the instability has all manifested itself all over, especially the greater Middle East. The weakness has been that America, which was supposed to be the global leader in this effort, went from one extreme to another. One administration was primarily depended primarily on military means. The other actually wants to completely back away from using American power against global terrorism in any significant way, especially in the greater Middle East. Global terrorist ideologies continue to flourish. Terrorist financing has been curbed to a large extent, but the terrorists are ahead in terms of being able to innovate how to move money. And the most important thing is that the global order is now has two challenges. One, states that continue to harbor and sponsor terrorists, and two, failing states are falling to and are being hijacked by terrorists in an increasing number. Technology, such as the internet, are being used by jihadi extremists all over the world for recruitment purposes without a counter strategy in place. And then, above all, while people who were involved in terrorism before and get identified, for example, Osama bin Laden, whom everybody knew was responsible for the 9/11 terrorist attack, while they have been identified and sought and brought to justice, there is no global method to be able to take preventive steps to make sure that those who are emerging as the terrorist leaders of the future can actually be identified and stopped before they organize. ISIS, for example, took many people by surprise. If somebody had actually been studying and understanding and analyzing the ideology that was taking shape in the crucible of Syria and Iraq, people could have actually identified that a new organization was emerging. So in a way, the war against terrorism that has been fought has actually been against the terrorists that attacked us yesterday and has not yet been moved in terms of stopping the terrorists who will emerge tomorrow and the day after. The accountability of state sponsors of terrorism has also been far from complete. In fact, too many compromises have been made. And the result is that there are many states that have got away with sponsoring terrorist groups and making distinctions between terrorist groups. Terrorist A is my ally because he attacks my neighbors, but terrorist B is my enemy because he attacks, for example, in the United States, and therefore I will go after some of these people, arrest them, and send them to Guantanamo Bay. So this haphazard approach to global terrorism has resulted actually in increasing global terrorism rather than diminishing it. Now, there is a positive side to it too. If you're an American, you feel comfortable that there hasn't been an attack of the scale of 9/11 on American soil since 9/11, and that is a positive. But the downside to it is that the terrorists continue to multiply in other parts of the world, and it's only a matter of time before they actually get their act together to be able to mount the kind of attack here that they did before. Because after all, remember, I as a young journalist covered the war against the Soviets. Many of these terrorists who later on became part of Al-Qaeda used to slit the throats of Soviet soldiers. And most of us didn't think much of it, because after all, they were going after the enemy. No one at that time did an analysis of what motivates them to be so, shall we say, inhuman in the treatment of the enemy. Many of the methods that were used later on in other parts of the world were actually developed in Afghanistan with the inclusion and participation of many of our governments. Then, when Al-Qaeda emerged and decided that it's going to attack the United States, its initial attacks were relatively smaller. If you remember, the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center was not a major one. It didn't bring the building down. It was, in fact, it was executed very clumsily. The man used a rented truck and went back to collect his deposit on the rented truck. Which basically brought him on the radar much more quickly. So the terrorists had a methodology of learning from their mistakes, and they kept improving their methods, and that's how 9/11 became possible. So if Al-Qaeda was formed in 1993, but its pre-formation took place during the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 1980s, it took them about a decade and a half to be able to conceptualize and execute the kind of attack that we saw on 9/11. Other jihadi groups that are emerging right now, other terrorist groups in other theaters, global theaters that are emerging now, will take a long time. So the comfort that my American friends sometimes feel over the fact that there has been no attack of the magnitude of 9/11 on American soil is cause for comfort, I think is actually not sufficient reason for comfort. The global terrorist groups continue to organize and multiply. Their own internecine and ideological conflicts are also conflicts that are relevant to all of us. What is the way forward? For one thing, I think that the humming and hawing over what causes terrorism has to end. Even this year at the United Nations, some of America's closest allies debated, as they do every year, on the definition of terrorism. If I were an American State Department official, I would actually ask my allies that you receive X amount of money in American aid for fighting terrorism. If you do not know the definition of terrorism, what is it that you are fighting that you are receiving this money from us for? So I think these definition of terrorism debates have to be brought to an end. That's the first step. Second, I think a system does have to emerge. Nations don't have to be destroyed, countries don't have to be occupied, and militaries don't have to be moved completely to do this. But states that have been sponsors of terrorism and that continue to partially sponsor terrorism should not be let off the hook for the partial good they do. So a lot of the allies, especially of the United States, that are partly sponsors of terrorist acts should not be allowed to go scot-free simply because they are allies in some other functions and in some other actions. Third, global terrorist ideologies need to be identified and combated. As far as the Muslim world is concerned, this ideological debate is going to involve primarily Muslims. And there's no way that the Muslims of the world are going to accept a definition of their religion offered by people who are not members of our faith. So I would advise against, for example, the White House trying to tell me that Islam is a religion of peace and the jihadis do not represent an Islamic ideology. Let us figure out how much of Islam they are following and how much of Islam they are not following. Keep out of this debate. And lastly, I think that weak and failing states that are being hijacked by non-state actors need support in building the state structure. But again, that is not going to be easy. There will be conflicts between states that will have to be resolved. Countries like Yemen, which are failing states, will end up being the arena of jockeying for power for other regional actors. And here, the international community will have to figure out how to be able to play a role. There has to be a way that the great powers of the world can get involved without necessarily repeating the mistakes that they think they have made by intervening overwhelmingly in Afghanistan and Iraq. There has to be a middle ground between sending large numbers of troops for long periods of time and not doing anything at all. And lastly, just as people are waking up to the threat of cyber warfare, I think they should also wake up to the threat of cyber recruitment, because jihadis do use the internet far more effectively. I have always wondered that the country that was able to come up with a recipe for sweetened, fizzy water and make it into an international drink purely through marketing, why is it so unable to market the idea of opposition to extremism and terrorism in the Muslim world? A question that requires, Professor Alexander, a conference in its own right. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Ambassador Haqqani, I wanted to mention, since you dealt with radicalization of religion, of course, your many contributions to the academic work, your book on Pakistan between the mosque and the military is a important, I think, contribution to our understanding. And of course, your work now with the Hudson Institute on the journal, the current trends in Islamic ideology, is very important as well. I would like to move on to our next speaker, Ambassador Theodore Katov. As I mentioned earlier, he was formerly the ambassador of the United States to the United Arab Emirates and Syria, but he also served with great distinction in Kuwait and Baghdad and Sana'a and Riyadh as well. And he received many, many awards for his many contributions. Also academically, he served as a fellow at Princeton University dealing with some of these issues. Ambassador Katov.
Thank you, Professor Alexander, for the opportunity today to speak with such distinguished company on current efforts to combat terrorism. Terrorism is not an abstraction to those of us who spent our careers in the U.S. Foreign Service, and I spent my entire career either working in or working on the Middle East, and so it's an area that's very familiar to me. Some of us have unfortunately experienced terrorist attacks firsthand. All of us have lost friends and coworkers to this scourge. Though many of us share similar tragic experiences, we, not surprisingly, come to different conclusions about what is to be done. Most area specialists and counterterrorism experts believe that the U.S. government's approach must be nuanced and multifaceted. That is, it needs to involve not only the military, but the State Department, USAID, Homeland Security, intelligence and law enforcement agencies, soft power, and public awareness, and I could go on, but you get the idea. The principal debate seems, however, to often, or too often in my opinion, focus on how large the American military response should be to terrorist threats. We, I think, seem to exaggerate sometimes what a military response can do. So this afternoon, I want to focus on what the balance should be between our military response and the many other tools and policies available to the United States. Let me state clearly that my 42 years of involvement with U.S. policies in the region have made me a firm believer in the law of unintended consequences. Even President George W. Bush once famously said in a presidential debate with Al Gore that U.S. foreign policy needed to show greater humility. Yet after two inconclusive wars that lasted for a decade or more, Iran is arguably left as the dominant power in Iraq, and the Taliban is poised to make a comeback in Afghanistan. Many of the principal architects and proponents of these wars mock the Obama administration for missed opportunities to intervene more forcefully in Syria and for not having left a residual force indefinitely in Iraq. Indeed, even some former senior members of the current Obama administration state much of the same thing. Some weeks ago, I was watching one of the Sunday talk shows and heard former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta assert that matters might have turned out differently in Syria if only the president had extended more and earlier military aid to opposition fighters there and had carried through with this threat to hit Assad's forces after he crossed our self-declared red line concerning the use of chemical weapons. Now, let me add that Secretary Panetta has given great service for decades to our country, and I have admired him from afar. Moreover, some of my own colleagues, who I deeply respect, share his opinions. But the question to me is this: which Syrian opposition forces should we have more forcefully backed? The opposition in Syria was splintered into literally hundreds of small groups that lacked a central command. The Muslim Brotherhood initially dominated the Syrian National Council. Even prior to the emergence of the Nusra Front and ISIS, there were other Islamist groups in the field, including the Taliban like Ahrar al-Sham that one of my colleagues earlier mentioned. Was our goal ever to replace a corrupt, bloody Ba'athist military regime with a barbaric, intolerant, and bloody Islamist regime? How does that serve U.S. interests? And by the way, we had many years to train the Iraqi armed forces under relatively ideal conditions. How well has that turned out? Why have Iranian-influenced Shia militias been spearheading offensive actions in Tikrit and elsewhere against ISIS? Why did the Iraqi armed forces come apart so rapidly when ISIS attacked Mosul, leaving their US-supplied weapons behind? Those who want to argue the counterfactuals need to explain why this time it would have been different. My takeaway from focusing on the Middle East, North Africa region for many years is that these countries are not ours to win or to lose. The peoples of the Middle East have developed cultures and value systems that are not largely consonant with our own, and we have to recognize and respect the differences. They have yet to decide clearly what role Islam will play in their constitutional governance. Who is sovereign, God or the people? The US and the West can encourage those whose values, such as pluralism, tolerance, and inclusion, are closer to our own, but it is not for us to impose those values on them at the point of a gun. It is sheer hubris to expect that every society will achieve our level of social and political development overnight. Indeed, many of them don't want to. And we ourselves are always going to be struggling to create a more perfect union. The neoconservatives and their supporters who never believed in social engineering at home thought nothing of going halfway around the world to spread Wilsonian democracy and values. If we want to put our money where our mouths are, Why are we not doing more to support Tunisia, which is doing all the right things? It seems to me that all the intensity is about what is going wrong in the region. Here is Tunisia, which could be perhaps the greatest rebuke ever to the Islamist fanatics and the bloody dictators of the region, and yet you hardly read about the country, except, of course, when there's a terrorist attack, as occurred at the Bardo Museum. So what is to be done? First, we need to quit exaggerating the threat that terrorism poses to the homeland. The 24/7 news channels have to fight for ratings, so every lone wolf operation in Europe or the US becomes an existential threat to Western civilization. Our police forces have become so militarized that it was thought necessary to virtually shut down the entire city of Boston and its suburbs to catch or kill the Tsarnaev brothers. Copenhagen and Paris have experienced similar phenomena. Yet right after 9/11, the Washington suburbs were terrorized by two non-ideological assassins who chose their victims at random. Many other senseless mass killings have subsequently occurred with alarming regularity, such as the horrible tragedy at the elementary school in Newtown, Connecticut, and at a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. Each year, tens of thousands of Americans die from influenza and are killed in auto accidents. Yet it is death at the hands of terrorists that haunt our thoughts and our dreams. The terrorists could hardly hope for more. That's exactly what they want. They want to provoke a disproportionate US military response. Another US president famous for a failed prolonged war was Lyndon Johnson. When running against Barry Goldwater in 1964, he stated that we shouldn't be asking American boys to do what Asian boys should be doing for themselves. Unfortunately, just like President George W. Bush, he overreached rather than following his own good advice. The struggle occurring in the Middle East and North Africa is existential, but it's not existential for us and not even for our Western allies. It is the governments and the peoples of the entire region who are most threatened. Groups pledging allegiance to ISIS, as was said, are existing in 16 countries. So after 2 major wars, the cancer has metastasized. The US needs to calibrate the help it offers to indigenous forces that are willing to confront ISIS militarily and otherwise. There are many groups and states that deserve our help, but we have to keep in mind that there are also groups, that those groups and states often don't share our exact interests. In many cases, we should not lend ourselves to advancing, for instance, hateful sectarian agendas, or get involved in the middle of a Sunni-Shia struggle. That is not for us, as Ambassador Haqqani eloquently pointed out. We should be willing, however, when we find those willing to fight this scourge, to provide military equipment, intel sharing, logistical support, training, including for special operations, and in some cases, air support, and as we saw recently in Yemen, search and rescue. But I think we have to ask ourselves, how would it have been received in the 17th century if the Turkish Sultan in Istanbul had sent the Janissaries to sort out the 30 Years' War in Central Europe between Catholics and Protestants? This conflict was so bloody that it may have wiped out 1/4 to 1/3 or more of the population in Central Europe, most of the civilians in the area where it was fought, before the war was concluded by the Treaty of Westphalia, which set up our current nation-state system. So I'm just saying. Thank you.
Of introducing a very special guest this year. This is our 17th annual review of international terrorism cooperation, and we've invited and have with us today Governor Jim Gilmore, the 68th governor of Virginia, close friend of the Potomac Institute and supporter for a long time. He's been a little bit of everything, from an Army officer to a prosecutor to an elected Attorney General on many corporate boards, the Air Force Academy Board, so on and so on. Most importantly, however, he's been appointed to many congressional and presidential boards overseeing topics as diverse as his history, but even most importantly, something known as the Gilmore Commission, which in 1999 was put together to assess the United States' ability to deal with terrorism. The Gilmore Commission existed not just throughout 99, 2000, but well past 2001. And with that, the Gilmore Commission was the venue, if you will, for the first line of advice, strategy on how to deal with a brand new global war on terrorism. Governor Gilmore was the author of this nation's strategy for dealing with terrorism throughout the early 2000s, and he coined, I believe, he's one who should be credited with coining the term international cooperation on terrorism for the good of the United States. It's with great privilege that I introduce to you Governor Jim Gilmore.
Michael, thank you very much. I'm struck by the story that the ambassador told about the terrorist who rented the truck and went off and blew it up and then went back for the deposit. At least he was a capitalist. I guess I'm your politician here today. I'm the one that was invited to participate with these distinguished professionals who have spoken to you here today. And I think that I was invited, as Michael suggested, because I chaired the National Commission, the Advisory Panel on Terrorism and Weapons of Mass Destruction on behalf of the United States. That commission was established in 1999, and we served until 2003, 5 years of work. It can be found on the RAND Corporation webpage under Gilmore Commission. I was also, after the 3 years that statutorily was expected to work, the governor of Virginia at the time of the 9/11 attack. And as everyone knows, 2 states were directly attacked that day, New York and Virginia, because the Pentagon is in Virginia. So actually, I ended up being, for a while, a war governor and had to do the things necessary to protect the Commonwealth and work on behalf of the people of the state. The German air crash comes to mind, the terrible, terrible thing we just saw. And it struck me over the weekend that the 150 victims who were on that airplane were actually still victims of 9/11, because all those processes in that airplane cockpit had been put into place to prevent terrorists from getting into the cockpit. Little did they know that it was going to be reversed on them because of this type of mental illness or whatever motive that we will ultimately discover. Those people died because we are engaged today in the global challenges that we're facing because of the tactics that are being used. We've seen it in Copenhagen, where the effort there was to try to enforce a certain approach towards the Muslim faith. Likewise in Paris, where a certain effort was being made to enforce a certain approach to the Muslim faith, which was to not be critical or not challenging in any way. Boko Haram, which has now tried to legitimate kidnapping, rape, slavery. ISIS, which is probably the worst example of all, where we are seeing beheadings, people thrown off buildings, people being trapped in cages and burned alive before our very eyes on the modern accoutrements of Western civilization through video. These are crimes. These are crimes against these are crimes against humanity. And it has to be said as such, and it couldn't be said in the most strongest way. Terrorism, ladies and gentlemen, is a tactic. It is a vehicle. It is a methodology conducted by people. And so we have to constantly be asking ourselves, what do these people want to achieve by the use of these kinds of tactics? And I would suggest to you that what they're trying to do is to destabilize the modern world. They're trying to undo the modern world. They're trying to change the status quo, which has been in place at least since the end of World War II. We are seeing the legitimization of attacks on civilians and saying that civilians are in fact combatants in this global war that we are seeing. So civilians are not safe And our states which set up our security systems are not legitimate because they cannot protect the civilians, which can be attacked at any point in time, and that is the point that the enemy is trying to make. They are attacking the economy. Bin Laden said that the goal was to attack the Western economies, to bring down the Western economies through the investment of small terrorist attacks and then requiring the nation states to respond very expensively. And we have now seen a few $100,000 spent at 9/11 and hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars spent in response, a pretty good return on investment by the bad guys. We have seen recently the consistent attacks on tourists in various parts of the Middle East. Why? In order to discourage tourism, so that, in fact, the economies of the target countries can, in fact, inevitably be weaned away from the tourist opportunities that are there. As chairman of the Gilmore Commission, we worked for 5 years, and we concluded that the only type of approach and response to this everywhere in the United States and across the world was, in fact, a decentralized response. Build up police, fire, rescue, emergency services. We will be building up the security systems in other countries, and they will be building up their military, and it will have to be a decentralized response, just as the attack is decentralized across the world today. But there are some things, of course, that could be very bad. For example, the attempt to fight these kinds of decentralized attacks through the rise of police states, or preemptive war. Several of the panelists here have been somewhat critical of the Bush doctrine of preemptive and unilateral strikes, and so am I. But nonetheless, I would suggest to you, as has been suggested on this panel, there is a need for a new United States foreign policy in the face of this challenge. Now, what I think has been alluded to here on the panel already is there's a line of thought. I just read a whole book on the subject in the past week that was published by the Cato Institute that said that the danger is really not all that bad and that we can probably begin to pull back in such a way. And I believe that, in fact, reflects much of the United States foreign policy today. On the other hand, the panel has been, and I think justifiably, critical of the neocons, who have a tendency to get out there, use military first, impose nation building in places where it simply will not work and is not wanted. And I believe that there is a middle ground that should be offered that uses all the advantages of ourselves and our allies with our economic diplomacy, military, and above all, cultural strengths in order to achieve a specific goal and a specific mission. Well, what is that? I think it's time to ask ourselves what we're trying to do here. One thing I believe we're trying to do is to preserve, as was alluded to on the panel, the Peace of Westphalia, the creation of nation states that was created, that the whole structure that was set up as far back as 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, that says that you have nation states in order to promote certain cultural values and certain values of individual people within those states. And today that is directly under attack by the Russians, who right now are making it very clear that borders no longer matter in Western Europe, and that if they desire the Ukraine or maybe even the Baltics, that is all in play. But also, much more in line with our panel here today, the issue of these radical jihadists, who not only want to undermine specific countries, they want to undermine all countries. They want to see, in fact, the elimination of countries and borders and the creation of a caliphate, and that is, in fact, what ISIS proclaims that it wishes to do. What is the purpose of the nation state if it isn't just if it isn't security of our people? But it can't be just security of our people. Nation states, and particularly the United States, has an obligation to assert its values. And what are these values that are worthy of putting forward across the world that begins to allow us to win the war of ideas? Because we are in a conflict not merely of car bombs and military weapons in newsrooms, but also in the minds of people, as has been alluded to here today. And what are those values? Democracy, the free enterprise system, which I would recommend to the United States, by the way, the rule of law, the freedom of religion and tolerance of religion, the advancement of women. At least these values should capture the minds of people no matter where they are worldwide. And I think, as the former governor of Virginia, about one of my predecessors in the office of governor of Virginia, a man by the name of Thomas Jefferson, who before he was governor of Virginia wrote the Declaration of Independence. And I remind you of those words: all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are not just American values. When he wrote them, they became universal human values and remain the ideas that America and their allies must put forward today in order to win the war of ideas. And that must be the mission for all of us.
Thank you very much, Governor. I think we would like to develop a Q&A discussion with the audience, and then the speakers will have another chance to respond. Would you please raise your hand, those who are interested, and please come to the mic. Sharon, would you please? Milton. Please identify yourself for the record, and just a question, not a speech, please.
Milton Honig is my name. My question is for Dr. Abdalaziz. The NPT Review Conference is scheduled to begin end of April into May in New York. What positive outcomes does Egypt expect from this conference? What are the important issues in particular? For example, the failure to hold a conference in Helsinki, one of your favorite cities, I'm sure, on weapons of mass destruction free zone, as ordained by the 2010 NPT Review Conference. So, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yes, we are heading into the NPT review conference next month. And of course, Egypt is going to this conference, and I think all the Arab countries are going to this conference with a very constructive approach in order to make it a successful event. Unfortunately, if we go back to the last review conference in 2010, we had a clear mandate to have a conference in 2011 in Helsinki to free the Middle East from all kinds of weapons of mass destruction. Unfortunately, this did not materialize, despite all the concessions made by Arab countries. So obviously, Egypt, as well as other Arab countries, are going to the 2015 review conference with the hope that we will have maybe a better mandate in order to have this conference held as soon as possible, because we believe that freeing the Middle East from all weapons of mass destruction is a priority and a necessity. It has to do also not only with states, but also with non-state actors, referring to the efforts made by the State Department, which Ambassador Jenkins referred to. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, please, 1 second.
My name is Amin Mahmoud. I'm with the Center of Egyptian-American Relations. And my question to Ambassador Katouf is, how would you advise the U.S. administration applying the Leahy's law, Senator Leahy's law, on Egypt after the coup, especially as we know that oppositions have local grievance in general, but because U.S. support the dictators, their goals become anti-American. And we know that dictators suppressed opposition soon will produce terrorists, and that's applied to the Egyptian regime, which killed thousands, jailed thousands, and I can go on, and we have evidence of that. Thank you.
You know, in foreign policy in any state, but particularly, I think, in the United States, there is always great tension between our values on one hand and our vital national interests on the other. And as the governor pointed out, it's the first job of government to protect its citizens. The United States tried to back democratic elections in Egypt, and it seems that everybody blamed us. I don't think he'd mind me saying it, because he says it very forthrightly, but almost exactly a year ago, I met with the, I was honored to meet with the Sheikh Al-Azhar, the head of the oldest, maybe, education and higher education institute in the world, and a leading, obviously a leading figure within Sunni Islam. And he was convinced that the United States had backed the Muslim Brotherhood, and that it had been our intent all along to put the Muslim Brotherhood in power. And nothing I could have said to the contrary was going to make it change his mind. And that's the view of many Egyptians who back the current government. And at the same time, those who back the Brotherhood and other similar Islamist organizations are convinced that the U.S. colluded in bringing them down. So as I was saying in my talks, I think the U.S. has to look out for our interests first and foremost. It doesn't mean that we don't still stand for democratic elections and human rights and pluralism and the like, but it still comes down to the peoples in the region having to decide what they want. And as I said, there are so many fundamental differences, including this idea of, is God sovereign, although I'm not convinced that God talks directly to anybody and tells them what it is that he wants here on earth. Or is it the people, or is it a small oligarchy that they're sovereign? So I know that doesn't really answer what you would hope maybe I would say, but it's the best I can do.
Okay, in the back over there, the mic, here is the mic.
I think the room agrees with me in thanking you for a spectacular panel today. My name is Rear Admiral Sonny Masso, and one of the things that we addressed is we talked about three things. Who are the terrorists? What are the root causes of their angst? And what we can do about it. And I think we did a great job talking about who they are and what we can do about it, but we never really spoke to root causes. Ambassador Haqqani's well-stated point about Sunni-Shia issues should be dealt with by Muslims. What is your sense on the counter-narrative? And I really asked the entire panel, how do we define an entire narrative when we haven't really discussed academically what the root causes are? What are your suggestions, and should America stay out of the counter-narrative, as your point was well taken again, Ambassador, concerning Shia-Sunni issues?
Actually, I didn't limit myself just to Shia-Sunni issues. I think that Muslims, whether they're American or otherwise, do have a role to play in defining Islam. But if non-Muslims start taking upon themselves, as the president did, in saying, you know, these people who are attacking are not really Muslim because, I mean, I don't think he has a degree from Al-Azhar that qualifies him as a mufti. So that was my observation. My observation was that the ideological divide within the Muslim community has to be addressed by Muslims. And if the United States wants to help, as Ambassador Katouf said, those Muslims with whom you have a shared value or belief system, that's absolutely something that you should do, and it is something that I would urge you to do because it is useful. As far as the roots of angst are concerned, first of all, there's no single root of angst. I mean, there's many groups, and each one has a different agenda. Some started out as local groups, morphed into something else. And some of them are actually ideologically motivated groups that basically want, as Governor Gilmore pointed out, that basically want to roll back modernity through what they see as sub-conventional military capability. I remember distinctly once seeing a demonstration in Pakistan, and some smart aleck there had a poster which said, a suicide bomber is a poor man's F-16. Basically, the argument he was making was, we don't have the F-16s, we don't have modern technology the way you do, and so therefore to bring you down, we are going to use this unconventional, sub-conventional capability. So therefore, the route, there are multiple routes, but then there is the ideologically motivated groups which are basically trying to quote-unquote level the field in their opinion, and therefore it's in our interest, all of our interest, not to let them level the field in that particular manner. Lastly, as far as the counter-narrative is concerned, actually the counter-narrative exists. The problem is that the 24/7 media here and elsewhere essentially treats all stories in a certain manner. And the counter-narrative is not a story. The terrorist narrative is. And so it actually gets amplified much more than the counter-narrative does. Within Islamic thinking, there are many sensible people, religious scholars, who have a very different view on things. For example, the Shia-Sunni divide goes back to the succession of Prophet Muhammad. Now, people like me would say, well, the succession of Prophet Muhammad is over 14 centuries ago. Anybody can have an opinion on it, but as far as my faith is concerned and my practice is concerned, and my ability to do good deeds and abjure bad ones is concerned, what happened in history is not going to determine that. And so therefore my faith should be focused on faith defining my action rather than fighting with somebody over a historic fact that took place 1400 years ago. It's a bit like if the Americans had a religious sect or a religio-political sect that still wanted to resolve the Hayes-Tilden election, which took place in what, does anyone remember? Any American history buffs here? The disputed election after President Grant, 1866 or something, 64. 68, 1876, okay, whenever. So it was a disputed election. And basically that's what the shoots in many,
Tilden and Hayes.
Yeah, Hayes and Tilden, yeah. President Hayes won, of course. And I'm sure there's somebody who argues Tilden did. Same goes for the Shia-Sunni divide. Should Ali have been the successor? Was the succession correct? Many of these issues are not relevant to modern life. And the counter-narrative is modern life. If the Muslims of the world felt that they had an equal stake in modernity and that their future was what they were building rather than arguing over the past and killing over the past, we would have a much better Muslim world.
May I add something?
I'll add something here. When I mentioned the socioeconomic aspect of terrorism, I meant exactly what you are referring to, sir. The lack of economic growth, the widening gap between rich and poor, the high rates of unemployment. This is root causes of terrorism, of course. But they are not only economic root causes, there are some political root causes. If you look, for example, at the Arab-Israeli conflict, when we leave such a conflict for more than 6 decades without a solution, that's a motivation in itself for young people to tend to be extremist or something like that. Other root causes are related to ideology, as Ambassador Haqqani mentioned. We have to admit it as Muslims that we have a real problem when it comes to the Islamic thought and the misinterpretations of Islam. So there are a lot of root causes that needs to be visited and discussed, actually. Thank you.
Professor Alexander, may I add something? It's such a great question. You just spurred all kinds of interest, I think, from the panel up here. We have the phenomena that there are people today who purport to wish to go backwards into a more barbaric time, but at the same time are using the accoutrements of modern civilization to do it. Modern communications, cell phones, modern jet airplanes, jeeps, machine guns, all these elements of modern life that are good, modern transportation, communication. I believe that we can't ignore, I would never presume, Ambassador, to ever lecture to any one of the Muslim faith. I'm not a Muslim, I'm a Christian. So I would not presume to do that. But the reality is that we're not going to be able as Westerners and as Americans to ignore this. The United States stands as the protector of the modern world today. It is not only viewed as such and perceived as such, it is the reality of where we are today. And it's well understood by people who wish to undo it. And therefore, they have to attack the United States. And we have to be prepared for that. Now, we can't get lured into every conflict because of the return on investment argument that I made a few minutes ago, that we can't be bled down. And that is a good approach to attacking a modern power, and we have to be careful about that. That's why I advocate a new foreign policy, one that doesn't simply pigeonhole us into a neo-isolationism or a neo-con type of aggressive type of approach. And I believe that a nuanced foreign policy has been discussed and can be created in a way that furthers not just American interests for security, but also the values of all humanity across the world.
Anyone on the panel would like to make the statement? If not, we would turn it over to General Gray for closing remarks. Mike?
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to quickly introduce the 29th Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Alaa Gray, who is the chairman and the soul of the Potomac Institute. General Gray?
Well, that's a pretty good speech, Mike. Why don't you keep going? That's pretty good. I want to thank our colleagues on the panel for a super presentation. You covered a whole area of matters and the like, and I think you did it in a very distinguished way. I think that, and many of you have heard me say these things before at these seminars, but I think we have to remember that it truly is an international challenge. It's an international challenge in any form of measurement because we're talking about the people of the world. We're talking about our friends around the world. We're talking about really trying to stabilize the world, trying to make it better, trying to give people a better opportunity to live. And it has nothing to do with combat and war and dropping bombs and all that kind of thing. It's a much higher cause. I agree with my colleagues, terrorism is a tactic. And I've said that many times, and others have too. And you really, I never have agreed with the global war on terrorism. It's the global war against ideas. It's the global war against ideologies. It's the war against the idea of people trying to do things barbaric, horrific, et cetera, through terrorist-type tactics and the like. I mean, what are they trying to do? I mean, they're trying to scare you. They're trying to worry you. They're trying to put fear in the minds of all. They're trying to separate what we believe in from what they want to accomplish. They're trying to attract attention. There's all kinds of things that they try to do with these terrorist-type activities and tactics, and it's not new. You can find examples of terrorist-type tactics in the Torah, in the Bible, in the Quran, and you can find it in our history. You have to look only as far as south as the Carolinas and talk about what they were doing in the Revolutionary War. These are the type of things that people do when there's nothing else that they can do. And they believe in what their cause and the like, and so they adopt these kinds of tactics. Mao Zedong made it part of his philosophy in his 4 ways of fighting a war. And as I've told the story sometimes, you talked about Vietnam and Indochina. If you were with me in the middle of October 1965, south of Da Nang, you would have seen a small 12-year-old Vietnamese girl crying and running into our lines. Her father had been a district chief. He was the one of 1,000 district chiefs that was assassinated by the Viet Cong in 1966 alone. She was crying and coming into our lines because her arms had been severed off at the elbows by the Viet Cong. Not a nice story, but these are the kind of terrorist-type activities that, that people will do. They don't deserve to live. They don't deserve to be supported. They don't deserve anything. And we have to understand that. But it's an international type of a thing. It's not just the United States. And I'm concerned a little bit about these vital interests and national interests. I'm not so sure that the national and the vital interests of all nation states and all those who desire to be free and desire to get ahead, I'm not sure they aren't the same. And so I think truly we could do something about this. There's no question that the military capability is really the least of our concerns right now. You're quite right when you talk about the political, the economic, the societal, the technology, all the elements of national power and influence. They've got to be woven together, not just by America, but by the international community that we know of today, the United Nations and all the others. So we've got a big challenge in front of us. We need a new kind of a strategy that's adaptive, that's smart, and that's resilient, and that understands the end state of what we really want to be free. We want to prosper. In my own country, I remember in 1974 at the Army War College when I asked Max Lerner, I used to escort everybody around because I was a dumb Marine and not smart enough to sit in some of the classes. But at any rate, I said, and he talked about the national purpose. And I said, well, what do you think America's national purpose is? And he said, to survive as a great nation and perchance flourish. And that's the kind of thing that I think our world is all about. We want to survive, we want to flourish, we want our children to have it better than we had it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and above all, in the case of my country, our country, we need to learn more about the world. We need to understand the mores and the cultures and the languages and what they think about. We need to understand and look at their world through their eyes, not ours. And so I think collectively we can do this. I wish my colleagues would get hot on this strategy right now, Governor and the rest of you. You got all the right words. But I think, I do think that it's a clash of ideas, and I think the good ideas will win out as long as everybody understands what this is really all about. So thank you all again for joining us, and it's been a great seminar.
Thank you all for coming. See you next year.